The most dangerous fallacy in science is the appeal to authority. Believing something is true solely because an expert said it. Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, Anthony Fauci, the CDC, is not science. This is what you call dogma, and it is a completely illogical way of thinking about something. Science is not about who said something, it is about whether or not something can be falsified and reproduced. That is what empiricism is about. And in modern science and academia, we have lost the art of logic. Logic is important in science because empiricism cannot exist without rationalism. Empiricism does not exist without the discussion section. We must be able to discuss things when we create theories. These theories must be logically sound and empirically validated. Something that is logical must be indicative and representative of reality, and it must follow certain rules and avoid contradiction. For over a century, the germ theory has not been protected by evidence, but only by authority, textbooks, universities, vested interests, and institutions, right? Experts repeat it and people believe it. And people assume it to be true. But an appeal to authority does not prove causation. Now, to preface the rest of this video, I want to point out the fallacy fallacy to stay, of course, logically consistent. Fallacy fallacy is essentially a mistaken assumption that a conclusion must be false simply because the argument used was illogical, or that someone committed a logical fallacy. Just because someone commits a logical fallacy doesn't necessarily make something untrue, but it is important to dismantle certain arguments. You see, just because one argument is false or flawed doesn't mean that there is not another argument for the same theory or concept or idea or cause and effect relationship that is true, that is logical. But as we'll see in this video very clearly, the germ theory lacks any valid logical argument, although what seems logical stands on no foundation, on no premise, often engaging in circular reasoning, and quite often contradicting itself. And within this dichotomy of empiricism, there is no empirical evidence to support the germ theory either. We have nothing but failed transmission experiments, hundreds if not thousands of accounts, microbes present in both health and disease, the asymptomatic notion, which we'll talk about more later, and disease disappearing after toxicities have been resolved and removed from the body, as well as when deficiencies are resolved as well. Any sort of research on injections, again, falls into this lack of empirical validity. There is no reproducibility. There's actually a reproducibility crisis in biomedical literature, and this is not separate from the germ theory. There is a reason why we've revised Koch's postulates to try to make them more attainable. There's a reason why we've invented things like the immune system, the asymptomatic host. There's a reason why we use completely indirect tests and false proxies to be able to determine whether or not someone is so-called sick. There's a reason why we invent terms like latent disease and latent infection. All of these things are theoretical backfill to try to fit the theory to the observations that continuously falsify the theory at hand. And in doing so, what we have now is illogical arguments. Much of germ theory is circular logic. Disease is defined by microbes, and then the microbes are used to prove the disease exists. When a microbe cannot be found, we look on the nanoscale and we see little circles in completely dead and stained tissue through electron microscopy. We call them viruses, we call them infectious. But of course, viruses have never been proven to exist. They're a laboratory artifact, and you can go and watch this video if you're interested up here. Regardless, if you believe in the whole viral narrative, they've still never been proven to cause disease in any capacity. And within the logic of virology, you know, within the cell culture, for example, cell dies, and instantly what's assumed is that there's a virus present, right? And so the virus is proven because the cells died. And that's why we use other techniques like PCR, antibodies, and electron microscopy to try to prove the existence, but there's never been a foundation, right? We know that electron microscopy cannot distinguish between viral-like particles and viruses. We know that antibodies are non-specific. This has been demonstrated empirically. And of course, PCR engages in another circle, right? The genome can never be isolated. And so when we do computationally create a genome of a viral sequence, It's confirmed through the PCR test, which was developed based on that computational sequence, right? It's a self-confirming closed loop circular reasoning. And so there's no foundation for virology. It rests solely on circular reasoning, and the germ theory does not escape this, even when you get into higher orders of microbes and parasites, etc. Additionally, even when it comes to the concept of a diagnosis, it's very difficult not to engage in some sort of circular reasoning here. And of course, we're getting into the semantics, and the definitions of words matter, but when we define disease as the appearance of symptoms and the symptoms of being indicative of a disease, you're engaging in a semantic circle. It's very easy to slip down into these ideas of lack of logic, right? And although it might seem that diagnosis can be helpful, when you think about true health, trying to achieve balance in one's environment, putting a label on someone is not helpful, and it doesn't stand up to logic. The fundamental axiom of logic is that A and not A cannot exist both at the same time in the same capacity. So an apple cannot be orange all over and green all over at the same time. My dog cannot be behind me and in front of me at the same time. And the whole essence of this is that a thing cannot both exist while the opposite exists simultaneously. Considering all of the same things. Of course, if there's exceptions, like my dog can both exist in front of me and behind me at different times. If I turn around, he was in front of me and now he is behind me. But what I want you all to understand is that this concept of contradiction, if we're going to introduce some sort of caveat, that's an exception to the rule, right? You must look deeper. If there's a condition, if there's necessary conditions for things to occur, then the cause and effect relationship is then broken, and we need to look deeper. Let's think of antibodies. These mean opposite things in the whole germ theory narrative, right? It can either mean that you are sick or that you are immune. So certain antibody tests, like the HIV tests, say you are a sick individual if you test positive for these antibodies. However, if you test positive for antibodies after receiving some sort of injection, then they will say, well, you are immune. But this whole idea of immune antibodies versus sick antibodies is not something that's ever been distinguished in reality or in empirical literature, right? There's not been an experiment to decipher between the two. So you may say the condition is, well, one is after an injection, that's how we know that you're immune, and then one is, because you were exposed to some sort of virus. But again, this doesn't hold up logically, right? That's theoretical backfill, right? Because we're creating this story to try to make the theory fit the observation. Because even when it comes to something like COVID, even after they tested you, if you had COVID, and then like weeks later they tested you, they said you still had immunity. Right? You still had immunity even if it was after an exposure. So what they're doing is they're taking these empirical observations and they're trying to make it fit their narratives. And for this to be valid, there need to be some sort of empirical proof that, there was such thing as an immune antibody versus a sick antibody. Okay. So another example of a blatant contradiction is the idea of the asymptomatic carrier. And I dove so deep into this in Module 1 of our Symptoms and Nosology course in the Beyond Terrain Academy. Point by point, we dismantled the asymptomatic carrier among so much more information. If you are interested in understanding symptoms, what they truly mean from a terrain's perspective, we're giving specific accounts to how to interpret symptoms and how to support them rather than suppress them. So make sure you go and check out the Beyond Terrain Academy. It is well worth the investment. Lock it in now. We do live calls on a weekly basis. We are ever growing with more and more information and brilliant individuals. So go and check that out. It is free to join as well. If you are interested, there are free courses in there, the true causes of disease, terrain fundamentals, and a little bit more in there for you for free. So go and join regardless, but let's get back to the video. Let's discuss the asymptomatic carrier, because this is a contradiction. A germ can both cause disease and not cause disease at the same time, in the same condition, the same species, etc. And so I've heard some backfill being thrown around when it comes to this idea that, oh, well, it's a different mutation, unproven, unfalsifiable. It's a completely unproven phenomenon. It's never been empirically validated. If anything, it's been falsified. But even within the whole COVID narrative, all of the different variants were still able to produce asymptomatic disease. And they say, well, no, it's more sub-specific variants. But again, not been empirically validated whatsoever. These are post hoc realizations. They are backfill, theoretical backfill, to try to make the observation fit the theory. The other backfill that's often perpetuated here as an argument is that, oh, well, it's host immune factors that play a role in whether or not disease is produced. And very quickly you fall into the terrain paradigm, because of course if it's terrain and host factors that are at play, that are the necessary condition for someone to be diseased, then we agree. I agree that the level of toxicity and deficiency within a host is what determines whether or not you have symptoms. I agree. I think that you can harbor parasites, fungus, bacteria, and be exposed to no matter what. If you are robust, if you are healthy, if you lack toxicity and deficiencies and stress, you will not have symptoms. And so yes, we agree, if we want to go down that route, if you want to say your immune system is what determines whether or not you get sick or not, I agree completely. We just use different terminology. You want to say immune system, but at the end of the day, you're still going to say that your sleep, your circadian rhythm, the food that you eat. If you eat too much processed food, if you're nutritionally deficient, all these things lower your immune system. And so really we're talking about the same thing. One's just a misnomer, the immune system, and one is more realistic. It's validated by reality, right? It is the host's terrain that depicts whether or not someone is sick and gets disease. Regardless, the idea of the asymptomatic carrier is illogical. The idea that a germ can both cause disease and not cause disease does not make sense. It is a contradiction. This isn't evidence for the germ theory, it's evidence against it. Now what we have in the world is most people, the overwhelming majority of people who harbor parasites or germs, are asymptomatic. And if they're asymptomatic, if most people are asymptomatic, then there are other necessary conditions that play a role in whether or not disease occurs. And so the presence of a microbe means nothing. And so removing the microbe means nothing because it's not the root cause. You're looking at downstream effects rather than upstream effects. And it's funny, I made a video standing right here the other day discussing this topic over on Instagram. If a factory is dumping toxicity at the top of the waterfall, it doesn't matter how much we treat the fish in the bottom of this waterfall, there will be toxicity present. The root cause will not be addressed. So another logical fallacy, the false cause logical fallacy, confounding variables. This is sort of more in the framework of empiricism, and so we're going to expand on that, I think, in a future video, and why germ theory is not empirical. This whole concept can be demonstrated by the whole idea of injecting monkeys in their brains with this whole stew of sludge that supposedly includes some sort of viral particle or bacteria. What about the idea that the stew being injected into a monkey's brain is actually what's causing toxicity? This has been discussed for 100 years. I mean, even so-called modern medical practitioners, doctors, scientists admitted that this was a false way of conducting science. If you inject someone in their brain with a concoction that contains toxicities, you're going to have, encephalopathy, you're going to have inflammation of the brain, you're going to have central nervous system problems, sleep disturbances, paralysis. So trying to prove polio by injecting monkeys in their brains with supposedly polio virus, well, ignoring all the confounding variables is not science, right? You're attributing the discussion to a false cause. Similar to how in Stefan Lanka and Jamie Andrews' experiments where they control the cell culture, When they control starving the cells and the cell culture or adding antibiotics, they realize that the cytopathic effects are actually caused by that controlled variable. They're caused by the addition of antibiotics. They're caused by starving the cells. This causes cytopathic effects, regardless of whether or not you add some sort of virus to it, right? That's nonsense. You still see viral-like particles. You still see cytopathic effects. You still see all of the things indicative of some sort of viral cause without actually adding any sort of virus. So really the whole idea, it's absolute nonsense. But we're going to expand more on this in a future video. So affirming the consequent is an interesting one. The reasoning essentially goes, if P, then Q. Q is observed, therefore P must be true. Right? So when you think about this, if a germ causes disease, which would be P, right, that's the assumption, then symptoms will appear. So when symptoms appear that we think is indicative of someone being infected, well then the germ must have caused this disease. And this is seen in diagnostics, and this is just affirming the consequent. It's resting just on an assumption. And this is seen largely in diagnostics, especially in sort of family practice type settings or walk-in settings. You go and see a doc, you have a flu or a cold, and then they just write flu-like illness, influenza-like illness, unsuspected viral origin, different things like that, right? Essentially what's going on here is that there's no actually confirmation of the cause. It's just assumed. It's just assumed that since these symptoms appear, this must be caused by some sort of virus or germ. This whole idea of assumptions is total nonsense. And I mean, we've discussed this with Dr. Cowan, and if you haven't listened to that podcast episode, make sure to go check it out. He's truly the inspiration for this video as well. His original video, A Lesson on Logic, is one that lives in my head rent-free. I absolutely love that video. If you have the right assumption, you can prove anything true. It's total nonsense, right? So anytime that something is assumed, right, and in the literature, especially the modern literature, everything is assumed, right? Because they say, oh, the foundation's already been set by people like Pasteur, Jenner, Robert Koch, so it's assumed that vaccinology is a valid field. It's assumed that germ theory is well established. It's assumed that contagion has been proven true. But when you look at the data, everything's been falsified, and there's no foundation. And so now we just assume that all these gentlemen throughout history has proven all of these concepts, and so the modern literature just assumes the germ theory to be true. A fever equates a bacterial presence. A PCR detects a fragment and you're sick because you have this fragment inside of you, right? It's just based on assumptions, right? It's based on assumptions, not foundational evidence, not on empiricism, not on reality, and absolutely not on logic. Reification is another huge problem in the germ theory and in biology, realistically. And reification essentially is treating an abstract idea, model, or metaphor as if it were concrete, physical, realistic entity. But this is just not the case. When it comes to the concept of something like the immune system, this is said to be this real, measurable thing, but it's just this theoretical construct stick together from indirect tests and theory-ladenness, and it relies on this warlike mentality, right? There's no actual foundation for some sort of immune system. We group these macrophages and B cells and T cells and eosinophils and antibodies and the primary immune reactions like fever, like inflammation, like the cytokines, and we group this all together as this sort of immune system, but at the end of the day, it's just a theory-laden soup, right? It's not as though macrophages don't exist, but when you look at what a macrophage can actually do, it actually works on detoxification. It actually works on rejuvenation. Macrophages can actually bioaccumulate and bioremediate toxicity. They can accumulate it in their tissues. Pharmaceutical companies actually have problems with macrophages because they consume their pharmaceutical drugs and remove the action. They try to protect the body from toxicity. So they have to actually override our protective systems, from toxicity, from deficiencies, are rejuvenating systems, you know, but then they stitch it together at this idea, you know, where we're fighting external invaders, right? It's this microbial terrorist idea, right? This is more indicative of our psyche than anything. Our psyches are terrible, are warlike, everyone's out to get us, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and we think that's the way nature is, but nature's not that way, and spend any time in nature and you'll see that. If you go hunting and you go on safari or whatever it is and you observe animals in their environment, you might think, oh, it's so gruesome, you know, an animal eating another animal. But it's like, you know, that's the circle of life. Like, you know, we can attribute emotion to that, but at the end of the day, like, if a bear mauls a salmon, you know, and feeds its cubs, it depends on the concept. You can tug on people's emotional strings, and again, that's another logical fallacy, the appeal to emotion. And that's done over and over again, you know, it's the appeal to emotion, you know, grandma, watch out for grandma, mom and pops, and you know, the Biden stutter, right? Like, you know, you gotta watch out for the people in the community. And it's just an appeal to emotion, and that's what it was the entire time. Do you not care about your neighbor? Get the shot, wear the mask. You know, so the appeal to emotion is another huge logical fallacy. And, you know, we could go on and on about the reification fallacy, you know, and it just lies in theory-ladenness, you know, the concept of a pathogen or a parasite, you know, these are just misnomers. These are not true phenomenon, right? Of course, microbes exist, and worms and protozoa exist, but their role in nature is not parasitic. It's always symbiotic. Nature is always symbiotic. And so you can tug on people's emotions, but again, that's not a logical way of arguing or reasoning. It is a way to coerce and control people, but that's another story. One point that I do want to bring up is the concept of mutations and variants. This is something that's treated as a realistic thing, but it's never been empirically validated. The reason that we see mutations and variants is because of the errors in the methods used. You know, we've not accounted for the errors in genomics, in metagenomic techniques. Like the virus can mutate. Well, if you've never isolated a virus and you can never recreate that strain or mutation or variant, you know, there's no reproducibility, right? It's not an empirical endeavor. And, you know, you're just making up this concept of mutations, but it's actually just your test can't reproduce anything. So things are constantly mutating over and over again. And then you create these ideas like horizontal gene transfer and all of these different ways that bacteria or viruses share genetic material. But none of it's been empirically validated. It's all theory-laden, post hoc realizations and backfill, right? To try to fit the observations to the theory, fit it to the narrative. You know, because if they don't continue this narrative, then the whole medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex falls. You know, if there's no foundation for it, you know, even if it's a false foundation and it's cracked and it's not looking very good right now, regardless, it's still going to be a problem. So I think we've done in for most of the illogical arguments in germ theory. Of course, this doesn't necessarily disprove the germ theory from a true Popperian empirical falsification standpoint. I do agree with that point. Scientist in me says, you know, we should continue to see if germs cause disease, but, you know, our ethics committees won't allow for a true controlled scientific experiment. So what do? We look at history, and what we have is hundreds if not thousands of failed controlled experiments, those of which we are documenting in the Beyond Terrain Academy in the Terrain Studies Library. So make sure you go join the Academy. Lots of value packed in there, really well worth investment. It's information that's going to last you a long time. You know, this terrain paradigm changed my life, and I don't live in fear. I live a pretty good life. I'm not rich, I ain't got all that much, but I got a beautiful wife, I have a beautiful daughter, I got some beautiful wilderness near me, I got this great dog that likes to run around in the woods and listen to Beyond Terrain lectures while I bore the shit out of him with these topics. But go learn about the terrain paradigm in the Beyond Terrain Academy. My point is that there is no empirical validation for the germ theory. There is no rational validation either. What we have is illogical arguments, theory-laden backfill, you know, terms that are just made up to try to fit the observation to the theory, and we just have no foundation. You know, the old studies, there's no foundation there. It's pure falsification of the germ theory. New studies just rest on the assumption that the old studies are valid. When you go read a new paper, you know, oftentimes now they don't even reference the old studies because it's just this dogmatic way of viewing the world. So, you know, it's time we get back to logic. Logic helps us understand valid and invalid arguments, and the germ theory does not have one valid argument. Anyways, I hope this was a good video. I think I covered most of the logical fallacies. I mean, this could go on and on and on. I mean, the lack of logic in academia, it's astonishing to see how little logic scientists use in papers. You know, you do not see logical arguments in discussion sections, and you don't have logical conversations with doctors and scientists either. Very rarely do I have a logical conversation with a scientist about virology or germ theory. You know, often we're resting things on assumptions. We're ignoring the circularity of our arguments, right? If you could provide the foundation, start us with the premise that's not in the conclusion. You know, it's amazing. Truly, it's amazing that we lack so much logic in our day and age. So, if you liked the video, leave us a like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Go share it with a friend. I think that this is a great video, great starting point to understand that there's no logical argument. If there is no starting point, that's the starting point of germ theory. There is no starting point. There's no foundation. So, do all that good stuff for me. Appreciate you guys taking the time. Take care.